Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. With Donald Trump set to become president, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen now thinks we urgently need to slash spending or risk financial crisis. Oh, and Janet's, quote, sorry about the $17 trillion of national debt she left on the living room carpet as Fed Chair and Treasury Secretary. Profiles encourage, and it only costs us 17 large. At last week's Wall Street Journal CEO Summit, Janet had the balls to now say, quote, I'm concerned about fiscal sustainability, and I'm sorry we haven't made more progress. I believe the deficit needs to be brought down. Now, more progress is a hilarious way to phrase it, as Treasury Secretary Janet's post-COVID deficits were $1.4 trillion, $1.7 trillion, and according to the CBO, it will be $1.9 trillion this year. If that's progress, I would hate to see regress. In fact, when Janet first took over the Fed, the deficit was just $500 billion, an innocent age. Janet's mea culpa comes as her own Treasury Department announces the deficit just hit the worst ever for a new fiscal year at $624 billion in deficit in just 2 months, October and November. That's almost 50% higher than last year, which would imply a $3 trillion deficit for this year. Now, I mentioned in previous videos how the 40-year trend has been that recessions tack another trillion or two on the deficit because taxes collapse and welfare goes up. So we're looking at $3 trillion when it's sunny, $4 to $5 trillion if it rains. That's not counting the wars. But it's okay, Janet is sorry. So how did it get this bad? For 200 years now, every crisis has grown the federal government. Bob Higgs wrote a classic book on this, Crisis and Leviathan, but the short is that each crisis explodes government spending, and after the crisis, it only comes down part way, maybe half. So every war, every financial crisis, every pandemic, every structurally racist climate crisis drives up the government's take, and when the crisis is out of the headlines, it never quite comes back. So to illustrate, the 7 years before COVID, deficits averaged $700 billion a year across Democrat and Republican presidents. During COVID, it jumped to $3.1 trillion deficit. Thing is, after COVID, they didn't go back to $700 billion. The 3 fiscal years since COVID, deficits are averaging $1.7 trillion. So they used COVID to seize an extra $2.4 trillion, and once it was over, they kept $1.2, half. Where did it all go? Did you see fewer potholes, safer cities, better border security, perhaps Walgreens where the razor blades are not locked up? Of course not, because the million-strong federal bureaucracy absorbs trillions and craps out DEI, regulations, and wars. It converts the whole into new power, new headcount, new mandates. Then it digs in, fighting like a cornered rat to keep what it stole. We are here. So what's next? Yellen, Biden, and Jerome Powell have dug a hole so deep we will need Elon's $2 trillion in cuts just to break even. Meaning, as Janet now admits, either Doge succeeds in chainsawing spending Malay style, or a financial crisis will do it for us. Can Donald Trump reduce house prices? A recent study by Redfin found that millions of Americans are skipping meals, selling belongings, and even delaying medical care to afford housing. 3 in 4 Americans making less than $50,000, nearly half of Americans make under $50,000, say they, quote, regularly struggle to keep a roof over their head. This is partly because incomes have lagged inflation under Joe Biden, but mostly because the average mortgage payment is now nearly $3,000, which is almost double since pre-pandemic. So either homeowners pay that, or they have to pass it through to renters. So how can we fix it? So Joe Biden's inflation, sadly, is permanent. The Fed will sell its children to avoid deflation. The other major ingredient, high mortgage rates, is also stuck, with Jerome Powell telegraphing he's in no rush to cut rates with inflation rising again. Still, there's a couple things that the federal government, Trump and Congress, can do. First is cutting government spending, whether through the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, or dare we dream Congress. This slows inflation so the problem stops getting worse. It also stops the bleeding in construction costs, which are up 55% since 2019. and are a major barrier to new housing. Spending cuts also allow lower rates since it gives the Fed breathing room, as in they don't have to strangle the economy with high rates and high mortgages if inflation is under control. Number 2 is specific policies. So mass deportation will obviously help lower housing costs, especially for lower-income homeowners who are hurting the most. A recent study found there's a shortage of roughly 7 million low-income rental units in the U.S., which by happy coincidence is roughly the number of low-income units occupied by illegal immigrants. Sounds like a perfect match. Number 3 is actually out of Trump's hands, property tax. So nationwide, these are calculated as a percent of the home price, meaning if your house doubled because the Fed held rates too low too long, or because mortgages are so expensive nobody can afford to move, you go from $2,000 in property tax to $4,000. This can feel like you're renting the house you own and they set the rent whatever they like. Unfortunately, cities and counties who set these taxes do not lower the rates when the house prices go up. They simply grab the extra money and spend it. And that brings us to number 4, regulation. You'll probably be shocked that federal, state, and local rules all conspire to push up home prices. This includes permits, zoning and land use, building codes that range from restrictive to predatory, includes regulations on homeowners insurance that's driven prices up by nearly half since 2019. It's tripled in Florida. And it includes green mandates that, according to my colleague E.J. Antoni, add $31,000 to the cost of a home. That's not including the appliances, where the Greens are trying to tack thousands on your fridge, stove, and air conditioner. So what's next? The biggest drivers of housing costs are ultimately government spending, inflation, or rates. But deportation, deregulation, and property tax can bring the burden down even if the feds keep blundering us into million-dollar starter homes. Of course, that would all involve government giving up control and treasure, so it will take sustained pressure to get Congress off their butts to help Americans who are trading food for rent. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. The holidays are coming. It's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. And the IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. And with Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans. And it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/IRA. If you own gold, you're probably very happy with prices hitting all-time highs. But your gold can do more. It can generate passive income for you. With monetary metals, you earn up to 5% interest on your gold and silver paid in more ounces. Accredited investors can earn double-digit returns in their bond offerings. All interest is paid in ounces of gold and silver stored in your account free of charge. If your metal is gathering dust at home or costing storage fees in a vault, it is time to start putting your metal to work with Monetary Metals. Visit monetary-metals.com/Peter today to learn more. Now back to our show. Donald Trump wants to unchain the financial sector to flood lending into the American economy. Will it boost growth or will it boost inflation? Last week, the Wall Street Journal summed up Trump's plan to eliminate overlap, duplication, and regulations that shut out competitors and reduce bank lending. Specific things he wants to get rid of include the CFPB, Elizabeth Warren's brainchild, which Mark Andreessen has characterized as, quote, terrorizing financial institutions with nuisance attacks. Elon Musk also wants to get rid of CFPB, not least because it hampers the entry of X into payments to compete with the oligarchs. The CFPB has actually been a lightning rod ever since Elizabeth Warren birthed it, both for its lefty jihads and because it's structured to be independent of oversight, meaning independent of voters. Now, beyond the CFPB, Trump has floated combining or restructuring the main bank regulators, the FDIC, the OCC, and of course, the Federal Reserve. Now, in most of finance, deregulation is great because it promotes new competition so customers are not held hostage by megabanks and oligopolies like Visa and MasterCard. But there's two big caveats both to do with banks, moral hazard and inflation. Now, moral hazard is when you tell a gambler he can keep his winnings, but you will cover his losses. That is our current banking system. Because banks have lobbied themselves permanent on-demand bailouts, So they're covered by taxpayers, the 2008 bailouts. They're covered by dollar holders, the Fed printing sweetheart loans as part of its so-called lender of last resort. And they're covered on deposits where the FDIC uses you as a human shield for banks. Give me the bailouts or grandma gets it. That means if you completely deregulate banks, all those bailouts push the banks to maximum risk. Thanks to the ironclad rule in finance that more risk equals more return. Now, in an ideal world, there's no bailout, so banks have to convince customers they're safe by being safe, but you go to war with the financial system you have. The FDIC in particular is a problem, not only for the moral hazard, but because Janet Yellen implicitly expanded the FDIC in the 2023 bank crashes, so it's now only got 0.5% coverage. In other words, the FDIC has $100 billion in its kitty, covering over $20 trillion in bank deposits. Where does the other 99.5% come from? It comes from your bank account in what's called a special assessment if the FDIC runs out of money. So you wake up one morning, your account is docked to cover some wildcat bank in Texas. The other issue with full-on bank deregulation is inflation. So only about a quarter of inflation is created by the Fed. The other 3/4 comes from commercial banks pyramiding on Fed money, known as fractional reserve banking. So if deregulation means more bank lending, it's fantastic for the economy. You get a tissue fire as they pyramid away. But it also means Congress and the Fed have to cut spending that much more. The reason is federal spending competes with private spending, so steel and workers could build a factory or they could tear down a racist overpass or feed illegal migrants. So if bank lending is going gangbusters, Congress has to slash spending to stop competing with the private sector and allow the Fed to sell off its $7 trillion balance sheet to soak up dollars without unsettling Treasury markets. So what's next? Regulations and bailouts turned American finance into an inflationary Ponzi. Deregulation could actually make it worse unless Congress radically slashes spending and reins in layer after layer of bailouts baked into our system. Speaker Mike Johnson just dumped 1,547 pages of pure donor-grade pork spending on the American people. One more chapter in the ongoing war between the uniparty sewer and the people it allegedly serves. The Republican House leader is trying to ram through a mammoth continuing resolution to fund the government through March of next year. Now, what he should have done is a so-called clean resolution where you simply continue the old spending levels. What he did instead is add hundreds of billions in fresh crony spending. In fact, 65 cents in new spending for every dollar of continuation, which, incidentally, he had specifically promised he would not do. Of course, he introduced it at the very last minute in order to goose-step small government Republicans into voting for this turd, lest they alone be blamed for yet another government shutdown. As Wall Street Maverick notes, we should have just shut it down till Trump took office in a month. We, the people, would be just fine. The bill is pretty much the horror show you'd expect from Congress. Another $8 billion for other countries' wars, $31 billion for, quote, low priority or redundant research to keep government-funded activists or scientists in beachfront condos. In all, it comes to at least $200 billion in fresh riders. All of this, of course, would drive up inflation, which Republicans swore up and down they would not do. The money is only the start. The bill also tries to tie RFK's hands on vax immunity. It exempts the corrupt Department of Commerce from public disclosure of sweetheart loans for big business. For a good measure, it also delays a money laundering database and grants duty-free access to U.S. markets for Haiti, both of which you can be sure somebody paid for. I mean, you paid for all of it, but somebody outbid you behind closed doors for every line of that. Oh, and a 50% pay hike for Congress to $243,000 per year, worth every penny, plus a congressional exemption from Obamacare because Congress never eats its own cooking. Senator Rand Paul summed it up that he'd hoped to see Speaker Johnson grow a spine, but he did not. Rand added that, quote, Democrats are clueless, big government Republicans are complicit. Now the debt will continue to grow until the U.S. dollar, quote, fails. So what's next? In recent videos, I've focused on what can be done on spending regulation in the border by the executive branch. In other words, Trump's team, including DOGE. The reason is we can pretty much assume that Congress will do its best to avoid doing what the American people just voted for, namely shrinking the government, securing the border and the streets, and growing incomes faster than inflation. If Congress isn't going to lead, at least they could get out of the way. Speaker Johnson apparently does not even have the spine to do that. So what can be done? In the House, it's very easy. Every last one of them is up for re-election in 2 years, along with a third of the Senate. That means they've got about 12 months to show some balls, or we the people start taking them out. In the old days, they could hide behind left-wing mainstream media. Those days are over. A word from our sponsor. If you run a business and want to get customers excited about your loyalty and rewards program, you can now implement Bitcoin rewards with Oshi Loyalty. You get all the perks of a full-featured loyalty and reward program with real Bitcoin rewards every time your customers shop, refer, and engage. Boost customer retention, loyalty, and lifetime value. And if you're looking for Bitcoin rewards when you shop, check out the dozens of companies in the Oshi marketplace at Oshi, that's OSHI.tech/shop. Start earning Bitcoin today. Now back to our show. Why do they tax when they can just print it all? Ask MMT inflationists and they'll say we tax to punish the bad people who have too much money. Ask most economics professors who lean left and they'll say taxes lower inflation since they drain private spending so it doesn't compete with the government. But the real reason why you shouldn't print is that inflation destroys even more than taxes. So the past 5 years showed us the catastrophe of unbridled money printing, but even in normal times, the Fed prints up an awful lot of money. In the 5 years before 2019, the Fed printed up directly and indirectly about $800 billion per year. That's annual change in M2. But a quarter of that is direct. The Fed buys federal debt, lending money to Treasury. The other 3/4, about $600 billion, is created by commercial banks who magic up the money every time you borrow it. Now, studies have shown that $1 in inflation destroys about $1 in GDP via reduced incentives to build and work. This does beat taxes, which destroy about $2 to $3 per dollar collected. But spot the problem. Printing $800 billion only raised $200 for Treasury. The rest was gobbled up by Wall Street loans. That means to get the same amount from inflation, you'd have to destroy 4 times as much. Not $1 with inflation, but $4. Of course, it doesn't have to be this way. You could cut off Wall Street by raising reserve ratios, putting limits on bailouts, or ending fractional reserve. Alas, you go to war with the system you have, meaning that 4-to-1 ratio is here to stay. Still, for fun, what if we did it differently? What if Treasury just printed all $800 billion? After all, that would replace fully a third of income taxes, toss in Trump's tariffs, and you are close to abolishing the income tax. In that case, in terms of GDP, you would be better off than taxing. Thing is, GDP is only half the story. The other half is wealth. Because inflation doesn't just sap incentives, it destroys your dollars, pours water into the wine of your life savings. To illustrate, Americans own about $31 trillion in bank deposits and bonds. A bond is essentially a dollar with an interest rate, along with $3 trillion in pensions that are not adjusted for inflation. Set that against $13 trillion in mortgages where you actually make money with inflation, your mortgage melts away, and it nets out to $21 trillion in dollar exposure for Americans, meaning a 1% rise in inflation effectively destroys 1% of that, about $200 billion of wealth. So add that to the $1 GDP hit, and you're costing about $2 in output and wealth for every dollar printed. Multiply that by 4 for Wall Street cut, and you are at $8 compared to 2 to 3 for taxes. So yes, you can replace taxes with printing, but you'll destroy even more, and so long as Wall Street's getting its 3/4 share, you will destroy a lot more. So what's next? Whether the government taxes or inflates, the common thread is that it destroys much more than it takes. Toss in the stupid crap it blows the money on. I mentioned in a previous video how $1 in bureaucrat salary destroys $158 in production, and it can really add up. Now, if the federal government is going to print money, the proceeds should go to the people, but ideally it prints nothing, backs the dollars with real assets, and taxes as close to nothing as possible. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.